Go live. Hello, welcome. Hi, I am Taya Graham, and this is our first ever interactive PAR episode. Welcome to the Police Accountability Report. As I always make clear, this show has a single purpose, holding the politically powerful institution of policing accountable. And to do so, we don't just focus on the bad behavior of individual cops. Instead, we examine the system that makes bad policing possible. And whether the show is live or pre-recorded, that is what we are here to do. So today we're going to be examining that system by talking to my reporting partner and co-host, Stephen Janis. Hi, Stephen.
Hey, Taya, how are you? All for having me or letting me come inside because this is a whole new thing for me. I'm used to reporting outside and I'm inside. So I'm very happy to be here. I'm glad to be inside. It's a lot warmer and it's kind of cold outside. So thank you for bringing inside. Let me do my report from inside a place where it's warm.
You are very welcome, but don't get used to it. Now, just to let
No.
you all know, please be understanding because this is our first attempt to do a live stream, so there may be a few technical glitches, so please try to be patient with us. And I just want to thank in advance Jocelyn Dombrowski and Noli D, who are behind the scenes in our StreamYard helping us out. So just to let you know how we're planning on running this, we're going to discuss a topic, we're going to chat, and at the end of each segment, we'll read a comment and a question. And so first, we're going to talk a little bit about over-policing in small towns and rural areas by taking a look at some of our most recent reporting on Milton, West Virginia, and hopefully we'll also have an opportunity to interview, or rather speak with, not interview, speak with a resident of Milton, West Virginia, Caleb Dial. And Stephen will talk about the intersections of rural policing and anti-democratic practices of law enforcement in general. Later, we'll talk a little bit about cop watching and auditing and whether or not this practice is productive and effective. And then third, we're going to engage directly with you and answer some of the questions you have sent us as well as your comments. Now, just to let you know, we did have a YouTube community post the other week where people posted their questions. So I will be engaging with those questions first because we promised them first come, first serve. And then we'll get to everybody in the live chat. So don't you worry. Noli D is going to be looking in the live chat, looking for your questions, looking for your comments, and we're going to do our best to get them on the screen. And just to also let you know, if you see me look away or what have you, that means I'm typing, looking in StreamYard, looking for your comments and making sure to put them on the screen. Okay, we've gotten all of that out of the way. So let's get started. So Stephen and I have encountered a phenomena that was a surprise to us, and that is how much the growth of policing has occurred, not just in cities like mine, like Baltimore, but in rural communities that hardly seem to need it or even want it. And the statistics are really stark. According to the Bureau Institute, incarceration rates have actually fallen in major metropolitan areas. Meanwhile, rural imprisonment rates have risen sharply in our cities. Jail incarceration declined by 23% between 1990 and 2019 in cities, but in rural areas, it rose by 222%. So by the end of 2020, 3 out of the 5 people who were incarcerated in jail were in smaller cities or rural counties, even after the reduction in jail population due to the COVID pandemic. Now, my thought is one reason for that change might be that we have seen a lot of jobs in manufacturing and mining have been lost. And one way to give an economic boost to a community and to provide jobs is actually by opening a prison. But I think many would argue that's a very short-sighted form of economic productivity. And a lot of the reporting that we have done seems to, really highlight this problem. So, Stephen, what are some of the trends that you've noticed in some of the rural policing coverage that we've done?
Well, okay, so let me start from a little bit further back and why rural policing
Go ahead.
is a much more interesting topic in some ways than city policing. Because one of the things that you see when you examine rural policing is sort of the naked pathos of policing and American policing in general. And why do I say that? Well, if you look at a city like Baltimore, where we have a tremendous amount of policing, one of the largest police departments in the country, you also have a lot of violent crime and a lot of things that can, in a way, rhetorically justify the over policing we see in Baltimore. Even though it isn't justified, it hasn't been effective. Still, when you're in a city like Baltimore, it's easy to sort of, or it's hard, difficult to sort of parse out what's really going on. But when you look in rural communities, and one of the things we came across every time I would report on an arrest in a rural community that seemed either abusive or out of line or illegal, one thing I would find is that there really wasn't that much crime in these communities. And so really all you have is this stark sort of example of policing decoupled from some of the social problems used to justify, its over application. And that became sort of an interesting thing because I would look at a community, we were talking about, we had been recovering some of the stuff with Blind Justice, who, was arrested for playing Pokemon in a church parking lot. And there were like almost the same in Madison, North Carolina, the same number of cops as there were crimes. And of course, Milton, West Virginia, as you mentioned, a city that we've covered extensively with the arrest of Cody Cecil. Again, another arrest that's very questionable. There really aren't a lot of crimes. But then you see this sort of police force that is disproportionate to the problem. And that gives you a sense of how policing actually functions in this country and why so much of policing is based upon the idea of excess capacity. And the reason that's important is because, policing has occupied a very strange sphere in American politics. And, when we talk about the anti-democratic impulse, which is really, really important concept, because, a lot of people say, what do you mean policing being anti-democratic or over-policing being anti-democratic? That sounds like, sort of an exaggeration. But really, when you think about it, think of another government agency that you can talk about where you're either for or against it. And there's no sense of accountability or any sense of how, that this institution has a purpose that has to be measured or any way to quantify whether it's effective. It's either you're for and against it. And why is that? Well, that's because policing puts itself in sort of a capacity to mediate, not just mediate violence, but also create violence. It has the ability to incarcerate. It has the ability to take our property. It has the ability to, pretty much rule our lives and our space. And for that reason, I think it becomes a question of almost religious fealty to it, right? And so that's where the anti-democratic idea comes from. Because if policing were a democratic institution, we wouldn't have to be talking about whether you're for or against police. We just talk about whether policing is effective, whether it's necessary, whether we need 12 cops or 17 cops in Madison, North Carolina, where Blind Justice, again, was arrested for doing Pokemon in a church parking lot. We wouldn't have those conversations, and the conversation wouldn't have that rhetorical framework, right? That just wouldn't happen. And that's why policing is anti-democratic. Because, we have to think about like the idea of democracy and the idea of the Constitution and many things that, policing was not part of the original design of this country. There was no professional police force enumerated in the Constitution. There was a Bill of Rights, but there was no professional police force. That didn't emerge until the 19th century when professional policing emerged in London. And then U.S. got in on. Over time, what has happened? Well, professional policing has grown. And now the Fourth Amendment, for example, where you can't seize someone's property without a warrant or, has pretty much been abrogated as long as you're driving in a car. And similarly speaking, our property has been seized, right? We have asset forfeiture, which Taya is going to probably talk about a little bit later, which is really, spiraled out of control, where you don't even have to be convicted of a crime to lose your property. So I think that, when you look at policing as a phenomena, if it were democratic, then it would be really within the realm of us to ask questions about it and say, is it effective? Not whether we believe in it or not whether we blindly support it or don't support it at all. And I think that's what you see in these small rural towns, where it becomes sort of a part of the rural towns power apparatus, right? Where, there's really not a need for 17 cops in a town with 50 crimes. So what other purpose do they have but to enforce inequality, to enforce, that there is an elite that has power and a non-elite that does not have power, to, enforce economic injustice. And I mean, I'm talking in broad strokes here because I think it's important that we take the opportunity of this live to really have a live discussion. But also, I have to say, how am I doing like outside versus inside? Am I still effective or do I need to go outside?
You know what? If you keep it up, I am going to put you outside. Actually, you know what, Stephen? You made a really good point when you were talking about profit and the financial incentives that we find in policing. And you're right. I do want to talk about asset forfeiture. And one of the things I noticed is that in town after town, we find police departments with staff and funding very much disproportionate to the number of crimes. And they're just stuffing these underfunded jails with many people who sit there because they can't afford to pay bail. not because they aren't innocent of a crime. And remember, you are innocent until proven guilty. And these are really small communities where police gobble up resources while residents suffer.
Yeah.
Stephen, maybe you could talk about some of the trends that you've seen related to the profit motive in policing. I mean, I think Milton, West Virginia is a wonderful example, but
Well,
what are some of the resources that the community could use that are allocated to policing? And is there a profit motive that's hiding here?
that's a really interesting question because it's an interesting form of profit, right? I mean, if you look at Milton and you say it's profitable policing, Milton being Milton, West Virginia, um, you have a situation where the police department generates about $600,000 in fines, right? But the police budget's 1.1 million. So the amount of fines has literally tripled, but it hasn't kept up with police spending. And of course, there's a zero sum game when it comes to court fines. It's not necessarily something that creates a lot of jobs. It's more what we call like a rent type of economic situation, extractive, where it extracts money from people, but it doesn't create a sense of growth or communal growth. And so when you think about profit policing, what it really is about is perpetuating the power of the institution, right? It's not like for-profit policing creates profit for communities. It doesn't create better education. Like it's not like police fines that police, extract from the community with over ticketing actually ends up benefiting education. It just ends up perpetuating the power of policing. And I think because I think when we talk for-profit policing, we miss the part that there's no profit for the community in this, that that any profit, so to speak, which might be increased revenues or fines, goes into the institution itself and only heightens its power. Because I look at a city like Baltimore where we arrest a ton of people. A ton of people go through the court system, but we spend twice as much on policing as we do on education. So where's the profit in that? And even in the asset forfeiture, they've used it to buy all sorts of things, new cars, tasers, whatever. But it doesn't go into like building a park or a beautiful school or giving raises to municipal employees. It's really used to incentivize more growth in policing, which is like kind of like giving cancerous tumor a way to metabolize, right? And I'm not saying that policing is a cancer, but it's something that can perpetuate itself through tools that's not afforded to other enterprises. Like I said before in my stand-up a couple of weeks ago, if if the pizza place down the street is selling pizza cheaper, you can't go arrest the guy and put him in jail. But policing has this power to exact fines and fees from all of us. All of us are potential customers, so to speak, or unwilling adherents to paying tribute to policing. And therefore, so I think when we talk about the profit motive, we have to be careful. The profit is to perpetuate the power of the institution and the anti-democratic force, that it exerts on our society. I mean, like someone was saying, I think Blind Justice said in the comments, the Fourth Amendment doesn't exist, and it really doesn't. One of the things that was interesting, we covered the arrest of Cody Cecil, who was in his RV parked in a private campground when Milton police raided his house. And they took everything out of the RV. They took all his plants, they took his growing materials, they took his checkbook, they took everything. But one of the things that was interesting is people were saying, well, if it's an RV, they can raid it without a warrant. And that was because there is an exception for an RV if it's actually driving. But when you think about it, how many exceptions are there to the Fourth Amendment? I'm sure there are a lot of lawyers that could quote me tons and tons of them. There are tons of exceptions to the Fourth Amendment because policing has carved those out, right? And we always talk about Terry versus Ohio and, being able to say, I have reasonable articulable suspicion, gives me the power to stop you, gives me the power to interrogate you. Well, what person cannot articulate reasonable suspicion of anything? So really, I think that's why we have to really, really examine this. It's kind of like when Milton Eisenhower talked about beware of the military industrial complex. Well, beware of the police industrial complex because it is insidious. And when we talk, I think it's great that you brought up the idea of policing for profit because that profit is not a profit for the community. Milton doesn't have a better water system now. Milton doesn't have a great, wonderful park. We looked at their budget. They don't spend any money on drug treatment, even though they have what many people have told us, a very bad opioid crisis, thanks to all the opioid manufacturers who dump pills in West Virginia. They don't have any of that, but they do have a larger police department. And so I think people, especially I would think the council people and the people who have perpetuated the system, think that there's some pot of gold at the end of this, but really it's all going back into the pockets of the people who collect it. And it's all self-serving and it doesn't bring profit to the community. So I think the idea of for-profit policing is has to be correctly understood if you're going to discuss it. So,
Stephen, I think you made so many good points, and how you're talking about how policing can be economically exploitative and really detrimental to the
mhm,
community. And you also talked about police aggression. And I think a lot of times when we think about police aggression, we think of police brutality, like the
mhm,
brutal no-knock warrants that ended with the medic Breonna Taylor of Louisville, Kentucky, being
yeah,
shot in her sleep, or the death of George Floyd. I think everyone in this country witnessed as these three officers slowly asphyxiated him to death. And that's often what comes to mind when we think of police violence. But there is another form of aggressive policing that we found in these small towns and rural communities, and it's this form of economic violence. I mean, people are
yeah,
having their wallets squeezed dry with
yeah.
traffic violation fees and court costs and the cost of bail and the cost of probation,
Well,
and these people are innocent until proven guilty, and they're
yeah.
sitting in jail because they can't afford to pay bail and court costs.
Yeah, did you see actually, Tay, it's really interesting. If you looked, we had someone put up a comment from Braxton in Milton, West Virginia. I don't know if anyone can hear me, but, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear
Okay.
you just fine.
Well, so Braxton said he's in Milton, West Virginia, so I would love to see some comments to him about this idea of
Yes.
for-profit policing. But, I mean, so yeah, back to what you were saying. Incarceration is one way of enforcing this economic inequality, and I think my picture, and of course, you have the issue that this idea of being able to put people into a cage, and this idea of being able to build prisons and build an industry around that builds a political economy which supports it. And you had mentioned in the show a couple of weeks ago a small town, I think it was Somerville, California, which was like, the state is closing down the prison because they're trying to roll back mass incarceration, and the town is apoplectic because they're like, we're losing our industry. But what kind of industry is it to house people? Um, what kind of industry is it to participate in that kind of industry? It again, I think it doesn't really create a sustainable nor productive economic system for the communities that participate in it. It's really, in a way, sort of, like I said, cancerous in a sense, and it creates all sorts of perverse incentives to say that, well, our town's going to be more prosperous the more people are put in a cage, is really, to me, an incredibly stultifying proposition, and a proposition which I think is insidious, and it can turn a town really into a strange utopia. I mean, I can't remember the name of the show that just came out about that. Oh, Kingstown, the mayor of Kingstown, about
Right.
Kingstown, Michigan, that supposedly had all these prisons aggregated into one area. And what you saw in that show was how it corrupted every facet of civic life. So, incarceration, all these things that supposedly bring profit or things that are incentivized, are really, I think, tearing these communities apart. And so I think we have to be very, very careful about the way we characterize it. And I would
Stephen,
pretty
I
much hear
actually,
from the guy from Milton if he wants to put a comment about what things are like for him in Milton, or how someone from Milton would weigh in on this if their town has been served by this increase of the police. Because we have heard from many people behind the scenes, we can't say who or what they have said.
right.
Well, we can say what they've said, but we can't really identify them. But supposedly the council will get a report every month on how many tickets each officer wrote. And they really, really, really said there was a tremendous amount of pressure if you didn't write tickets. Now, what good does that do anybody?
Right. I mean, is that technically is not a quota system, but how could a police officer not think
Mhm.
that his ticket writing wasn't going to be directly related to him receiving promotions and to him receiving accolades? So to say that having police officers have the number of tickets they actually write for residents put in front of the city council won't influence them, that's absurd. It may technically not be a quota, but it obviously influenced the police department. And we saw that because around 2016, there was a change in who was the chief of that police department. And there was an immediate increase in the number of traffic tickets that were written, the number
Mhm.
of court fees and fines. From about 2016 onward, Milton, West Virginia went from roughly gathering around 120,000, $130,000 years in court fees and court fines, and went to around $600,000 a year. Now, does that mean the people in Milton suddenly become incredibly more criminal, or does that mean there was a change in the policing
Yeah.
policy? So, Stephen, I have to ask you, this type of like aggressive enforcement, what we call over policing, do you think it actually makes communities any safer?
There's really no evidence correlating, police intervention with lower crime rates. I mean, Baltimore should be the safest city in the country, given that we have one of the highest proportionate police people proportionate to residents in the country. And so it's very hard to correlate safety with policing. As we discussed on our show next week, we're talking about zero tolerance. Baltimore City arrested 100,000 people a year for about 7 years, and it didn't really affect the homicide rate in any significant way. And we've seen that, and we've seen different, increases in the budget, different strategies. I don't think you can correlate the two because, I don't think policing can solve complex social problems. It's really a solution at the very end. If someone decides to pick up a gun and shoot someone, you have to arrest them. But in the way it intervenes in the kind of things that you're talking about, right? In the sort of the minutia of our lives, that's completely and utterly destructive. And it's really interesting. I was reading an article about the Ninth Amendment to the Constitution, which is really never talked about, but it's an amendment that basically says any rights that aren't enumerated, are not considered to be not there. In other words, the court and our system has a way to create rights that we haven't been enumerated in the Bill of Rights. But what really struck me, what made me so interesting about that is, and to the point of policing being anti-democratic, is that the entire law that is constructed around things like qualified immunity has been constructed to allow this idea of policing to utterly dismantle our rights, not create more rights for us, right? Not create more, empower the citizenry more, but actually the opposite, is to erode the rights that were actually enumerated in the Bill of Rights. It's so strange to think about. We did a really interesting interview with a person from the Cato Institute about qualified immunity. And we've talked a lot about qualified immunity, and many people bring it up, and it's very important to understanding how powerful policing is. But what's so twisted about it was I believe it was federal statute 1980, was actually created during the Reconstruction period. This is what qualified immunity is based off of, was created so that people could hold public officials accountable if they violated their constitutional rights. And what comes out of that legal system? Well, what comes out of it is a way to prevent you from suing police who violate your rights. How twisted is that? And why does that occur and exist? Because we have this professional modern police state, which has political influence, power, political economy, the ability to fine us, ticket us, put us in jail. And thus, I think really it's corrosive, right? Policing is socially, legally, and in a way symbolically corrosive to the idea of the Constitution. Let's remember, the Constitution was constructed by people who were very skeptical of power. I mean, it wasn't something written in stone that wasn't meant to be changed or somehow evolved as we go along. They were just skeptical of power, and they knew that people who accumulate too much power were dangerous, and that human nature was to accumulate more power. So why are we giving these people the professional power to intervene in rights that were enumerated as a starting point, not as the end game, but just as a starting point? Like, hey, you have your First Amendment. We know we got to have your right to free expression, your right to your property, et cetera, your right to non-self-incrimination. So how does it turn out that those rights get eroded, and the Ninth Amendment, which could really carve out more rights for us, like the right to privacy, which really I think was a result of the 14th Amendment. But why have we ended up in this position where we're trying to defend the erosion of our rights? I mean, that's really extraordinary when you think about the Constitution being really what I would say, and I'm not a legal scholar, but a skeptical document of the concentration of power. How do we end up with so much power concentrated in one individual with a gun and a badge, with who knows how much training, with the ability to adjudicate our rights on a street corner, at the end of the barrel of a gun, in a traffic stop? I mean, that's really, I think, to me, something that I think the founders, I don't like to go into their intention, but the people who wrote the Constitution would probably be horrified that you had these people out there with guns and badges adjudicating our rights and deciding whether they should be taken, our freedoms of all things. And so, I think any talk of for-profit policing, incarceration, really has to get to the core of the fact that there are anti-democratic ethos, pathos, tendencies in American policing that are really writ large in small communities. When you see the disproportion between, I've got 12 police officers, as I said, it's a blind justice town, Madison, North Carolina, 17 police officers, like 40 crimes. And there's where you see no right-minded citizenry would say, we need that many police officers. Only as an institution that can perpetuate itself through anti-democratic impulse could exist in such a form. And I mean, look, in Baltimore, we've had thousands of police officers, and we still have the same amount of crime. How does policing keep perpetuating itself? And now, when we try to talk about holding police accountable and saying, now it's become defund or fund, It's become completely completely an argument of two opposites, right? As if there's nothing about the institution that has to be functional. We just have to support it blindly, or we just absolutely hate it for some reason. What about if we want to make a better community and we want to have our constitutional rights and we want to expand them to make ourselves a more free nation? What if we want to do that? I mean, and policing is getting in the way in places like Milton. It's not serving the community. The police are not serving the community. We can't say that because you're either for or against it, or you're just against police. No, no, I'm against dismantling our constitutional rights. I'm against not progressing as a society. I mean, how are we supposed to progress? Look at Baltimore. Baltimore has not progressed. It has not progressed. We have not solved our complex social problems because we have embraced policing beyond any other institution. We are the perfect example, Milton, of what happens when a community invests more in policing than in education and other social programs. This is what happens. And, we always used to joke that Baltimore, the Constitution was suspended. Well, now you're seeing it in other cities. So I think it's a complex problem. Whoops, I might have gone over a little bit.
No, Stephen, you made such excellent points. I did not want to interrupt you because, as like one commenter said, you were spitting fire. I did not want to get in the way of that. But you said something that you touched on when you were talking about the Constitution. You were talking about it from the end of protecting those rights. But one thing that we don't talk about is how there's a psychological cost to policing and how that affects your political efficacy. So when I say political efficacy, I mean that your ability to feel that you have the right and the influence over your government officials, that you are able to actually make a difference in how you are governed. That's your political efficacy. And there have been studies that show that people who have been arrested, who've been put through the criminal justice system, they don't have political efficacy anymore. They don't feel like they can make a difference. And so that means if you don't feel like you can influence your government, that means it's easier to violate your rights. That means you feel like you allow your rights to be violated. I think there's a psychological cost to policing that people don't realize. I mean, when it came to Milton, West Virginia, there are people who reached out to us, but they begged us to remain anonymous because they were so fearful of retaliation. So if you're afraid to speak your mind and to speak your truth, that affects your political efficacy, that affects your ability to make a difference in your community. And people are living in misery and fear and are afraid to come forward. So there's a psychological toll there because it hems in your possibilities and your power. I mean, Stephen, I know that's something you can speak to.
Well, let's remember that, if you are in many states charged with a felony, you lose your right to vote, right? We don't allow prisoners to vote. But given the efficacy of our criminal justice system, how many people, Taya, you and I have seen walk out of a jail who had been there for dozens and dozens of years illegally.
Oh my gosh,
right?
Yes, so many times.
Who were not convicted, who were not guilty of the crime. They literally have the power to take away one of our most fundamental rights, right? The right to vote, by simply charging us with a crime. And so I think that is a major mistake for a country based on skepticism of power and concentrated power. We have concentrated power in an extreme form and then spread it out through 18,000 separate. And that's the other thing that's really interesting about when we looked at Milton. There were a lot of towns that didn't do what Milton did. Because, for whatever reason, maybe they didn't think it was a good idea to ticket all their, or usually a town that was more wealthy, let's say, had a higher medium income, was not about to start ticketing people to death. What we figured out to be $250 for every person. But of course, they do a lot of their ticketing on the highway. Nevertheless, the point was, the richer the town, the less likely you were to see a court finding a lot of people. Okay, and what does that tell you? It tells you that people who have some political, efficacy, as you say, or some agency, aren't going to tolerate over policing. It's only focused on people who don't have the power to fight back. And how do you ensure they don't have the power to fight back? Well, keep charging them with stuff. There are people we literally have in this country. We have outlawed debtors' prisons, 150 years ago? It's federally outlawed them. And yet we have them. And they're all the result of law enforcement. They're the result of law enforcement fines. They're the result of the fact that someone, gets charged with a ticket, can't pay it. They get an FTA, they get another fine, they can't pay it, and they incarcerate them. I mean, I think in this country, we can all agree that debtors' prisons are really a bad idea, not just from the perspective of, being understanding of people getting debt, but how could a person pay a debt when they're behind bars? And yet our law enforcement industrial complex has actually created an environment where debtors' prisons are allowed, where judges are allowed to lock people up because they can't pay a fine or a court fee or because they don't pay for their ankle bracelet or something absurd.
Right.
Speaking of our sometime guest Eric Brandt, who is in prison right now for 12 years, and we won't go into all that, but he had multiple ankle bracelets.
I believe he had 3 ankle bracelets on at one time.
Yeah.
3.
So
Yes.
this industry created around, and you talk about the psychology of it, and the psychology, I think, you as an African American who lived in Baltimore, who
Yes.
lived under the regime of zero tolerance. We remember when we first became friends, you said, I can't go out unless I have my ID. And I'm like, you don't need an ID to go
Right.
out
You
in
were
America.
absolute. You were absolute. You couldn't believe it when I said I cannot
Yeah.
leave the house without my identification. You thought I was joking. You're like, that this isn't America. You don't need papers to go outside
Yeah.
the house.
It's not.
But with
It,
and the thing is I just wanted to add that it's because technically I lived in a high crime area. Well, if you know anything about Baltimore City, there's a lot of high crime
well,
areas there. So to be able to pull someone aside, ask them for their identification, and if they had the misfortune of not having a state issued ID on them, be able to actually run them down to central booking is horrifying. And that's what occurred during the zero tolerance era
right.
in Baltimore City.
Well,
And let me just tell them what the zero tolerance era
yeah, sure, of
is,
course.
because I'm worried they
Well, no,
might
I
not.
mentioned that. I mentioned that already. I
Oh,
mentioned that already.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
You talked
But I
about the
mean,
zero
but
tolerance area. I mean, 100,000 people arrested a year in a
yeah.
city of 600,000. That's absurd. That's 1 in 6 people, not counting repeat offenders, of course.
Well, we actually found when we were doing our investigation in the police, in their police manual, which has all sort of the administrative rules, that they said you could arrest a person for not having an ID. That is completely unconstitutional, absolutely, literally unconstitutional. And there it was in the Baltimore Police Administrative Manual that if a person doesn't have an ID, you can arrest them. You can't do that. The First Amendment is specific: the right to free assembly. I mean, and so you say, well, how is policing anti-democratic? Well, there's an example. And Taya, when we look through the statements of probable cause, again, in many of the zero tolerance arrests, they would ask a guy, say, do you live in this neighborhood? He would say, no. And then what would happen? They would arrest him. Now, how is that not anti-democratic that a guy can't walk across a sidewalk, a city sidewalk? And of course, maybe you can talk about this, but one of the biggest inventions in Baltimore was failure to disobey a legal order, or what they would call contempt of cop arrest, which is really, I think, one of the scariest forms of arrest.
Absolutely. And in some ways, it even can stifle dissent, because a contempt of cop arrest is essentially a police officer gives you an order and you fail to obey. So they give you
Right.
a
And
failure
whether or
to
not the
obey an
order is
order,
legal.
but whether or not that order is legal, like Stephen said, is a completely different question. So it simply can be, I have seen people arrested for simply talking back to a cop,
Right.
or simply walking. As a matter of fact, Sergeant Ethan Newberg, who in Baltimore City was making around $234,000 a
Right.
year. Let me say that again: $234,000 a year. We have this officer on camera have someone, he was arresting someone, he put them, had been raining, he sat them down on the wet ground. A passerby walks by and says, hey man, that's not right, you shouldn't sit him down on the wet sidewalk. That man ended up being arrested for what? Making a comment. So that's the type of contempt of cop arrest we're talking about, right, Stephen?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, and I think all these things, when you talked about the idea of psychology, the psychology that space no longer belongs to the people, but belongs to an administrative force armed with guns and badges and the ability to arrest, has a tremendous psychological effect on the populace. Because it's one of our fundamental abilities to redress the government, or address the government, and to petition the government, and to assert ourselves in the political process, through protest or through participation. And if you say, well, I can patrol this space, this is profound. This is a profound power. I can come into the space, order you to do something. And if you don't do it, I can take away your freedom and incarcerate you and lock you in a cage. I mean, that is a psychology of power over space that is devastating to a community. We saw it firsthand in Baltimore. But, I would imagine what I found very, very, I guess, discouraging about Milton was that we had a lot of people reach out to us after we did our initial reporting and say things are terrible here and police are really abusing us. And then after a while, they stopped calling us because someone must have put the fear of cop in them, and they have stopped contacting us. I don't know if the cops are reading, our Facebook messages or what, but I don't know what happened. but it is exactly what we're talking about. People are so fearful. They are afraid to petition their government to say, we don't want to live like this anymore. We don't want to live in terror. We don't want to live in fear. And we're trying to get our life together, or maybe we've had some problems in the past, but we want to get better. But there are no city services for them. There's no drug treatment or anything, but instead a absolute fear of talking to the media, exercising their fundamental First Amendment rights. They are afraid to do it. Is that the United States of America? We want to criticize other countries and say we are this pillar of democracy and free expression. But why are people afraid to call us? They're not calling us for any other reason but that they are very scared of their own government. Now, what does that sound like to you? Does that sound like America? Because that doesn't sound like America to me. But the same thing went on in Baltimore. When I would write about people who had been the victim of police abuse, the first thing the police would do when I asked them for comment was send the criminal record. And much of that record was just bogus arrests for bogus reasons, for sitting on a stoop and drinking a beer or walking a neighborhood. And they were fearful of, well, I don't know if I want to do the story because the police are going to retaliate. Why on earth do we allow the police to retaliate against people for speaking their minds? I mean, why do we even allow that in this country? And what exactly, are we letting into our civic cells if we allow that? I mean, the people of Milton are scared. What are they scared of? I mean, they're scared of their own government. I mean, that's insane. And not to be able to talk to the press. You actually had contacted a woman who had been very vocal about the bad water. This is a deadly crisis, right? The water in Milton is horrible. We pulled all the EPA complaints, and they were numerous and disturbing.
Right.
And what happened with that woman?
Well, that was really unfortunate. I spent the time, when we look into a small town, we really try to do our due diligence. So I actually spent time watching a water board meeting in Milton, West Virginia, and I saw a couple of the residents speak with incredible eloquence and insight about the problem with the water in Milton. And the problem with water there is that it's brown. It's not just that it's low pressure, because that's a problem too, but it's actually brown. And she had her water tested, and it turned out that the contaminants were over 336 parts per million. And at about 300, you're supposed to have a water advisory that says for children under 6 months,
Right.
for the elderly, as well as, if you have any sort of liver disorders, that you can't drink that water. So the water they have a serious problem with the water. So I was hoping that someone would speak to us about that, because one of the issues that we saw with the Milton Police, with the budget, is that the Milton Police Department is receiving monies that perhaps could be reallocated for something like making sure people have clean, safe drinking water, but we weren't able to get anyone to speak with us on the record about that issue. And to me, that talks about that sort of anti-democratic and very chilling effect it has on people's power of being able to enact their First Amendment rights.
No. That's what I meant. I mean, what happened was she said she didn't want to make a comment, which I thought was very unusual, because we were actually, going to report it. But I think it had to do with the overall feeling in that town that people just were scared of talking to the media. Okay, so I think the First Amendment of the Constitution protects speech, protects freedom of the press, gives you the right to petition your government. So, and we want to say policing isn't anti-democratic, or at least, anti-freedom, in the sense that they're so scared of this police department that they don't want to talk about water that could be killing their children. I want you to think about that. I mean, I want you to think about that within the broader context of American law enforcement. And the reason I talk about this is because I've seen this before as a reporter. People have been scared up. We were just doing a talk in a library out in Illinois about our documentary, The Friendliest Town. And it's about a small town police chief who orders his officers to get out of their cars and walk. But one of the things we were talking about was how this police chief, Kelvin Sewell, had, instead of arresting people, helped them get jobs, helped them apply for college, and it screwed up the business of policing. And one of the organizations and groups that was angry about this was a drug task force that'd like to come to his town and raid and arrest people. And he pushed back. And what happened to him? Well, for a lot of variety of reasons, not just this, they ended up indicting him for, listen to this, not charging someone with a crime who smashed into two parked cars. Think about that. Not charging them, right? He decided that it didn't warrant criminal charges, and they charged him for that. Now I want you to think about what that tells you, what message that sends to police officers, that every time they go out, if you don't charge you with a crime, then you're going to be charged with a crime. Now, how heinous is that in terms of warping public policy and the psychology, our freedom to make distinctions? Human beings are imperfect. We make mistakes. We do things, that sometimes we smash into a car. But do we need to go to jail for it? And if the officer doesn't charge us with a crime, do we charge him with a crime? And then, of course, as we noted in the documentary, when we tried to investigate it, they put our reporting in front of a grand jury as part of a witness tampering case. So, police, we have to really, we're in a crisis, I think, in terms of the power of law enforcement. It is way.
And you know what's, Stephen, I just want to say you're right. We are in a crisis, and I think that's why the American people are reacting. I think that's why part of the reason why we're seeing the auditor movement and the cop watcher movement. I think that's why so many people have decided to try to take back some power, and they're taking out their cell phones, they're buying cameras, and they're taking the time to listen to police scanners and show up to traffic stops and actually just film the police. And it's a movement. And I think it's to push back against that sort of anti-democratic impulse that you're seeing flow from our government into policing, into our communities. And it's us, the citizens, who are pushing back. And so now, not all auditors are police auditors, but generally speaking, when an auditor's video goes viral, it does have something to do with police. And I thought, Stephen, maybe we'd want to share a clip of one of the let's say cop watches that we saw that, it went well. It was interesting. Can I share the video? Do you mind if I share the video of SIP?
You can share it.
Okay,
I can't share it.
Let me share the video of.
So, that's what I'm talking about. Ain't nobody, don't mean you no harm.
Can I see your driver's license?
There you go.
Present it to me in my hands.
No, I'm not presenting you shit. I'm going to display it to you. Anything else you need?
Do you have insurance?
Yes, I
Can
do.
I get your insurance card and your registration, please?
I got you a little staticky, but
Write the ticket. Go ahead. I ain't giving you shit. I can display it to you. If you got a problem with it, let me know. Now do your job. Don't scare me like that. You just fucking scared me.
You
So?
scared.
See, don't do. Stop, man.
Sir, stop reaching for stuff.
I'm trying to get you that motherfucking license. Fuck out of here, lady.
She got her hand on her gun.
Stop reaching for
Tracy.
anything.
Fuck is this?
Keep your hands on the steering wheel.
All right, you saw my driver's license, so it's on your recording.
Present it to me, and you're failing to do so.
I done showed it to you. It's case law that I displayed it to you. I can display it to you. I ain't gotta give you nothing. No, it's not fake. It's not fake.
If you don't present it to me.
Hey, this lady say my driver's license is fake. Stop knocking on my motherfucking window.
Wow.
Oh, wow. Right?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. That is.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So now, not every cop watcher is able to inject that level of humor into his video. And I have to admit, let me just be completely candid for a moment. When he put his ID up and she reached to get it and he slid it, he slid it away from her. Oh my goodness. Steven.
I think it shows the power of the camera, because I don't think if there wasn't a camera there that cop would have.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
No, I don't think it would have gone quite as smoothly if they didn't know that he had his camera up and that he was live streaming it, because I do think there have been occasions where police officers have taken a cell phone camera, they've demanded to get someone's PIN, they try to get in, and and I've even had people tell me that video has been tampered with or erased completely. So he was right to live stream it. So just a little shout out there to SIP can see a higher power there.
Yes.
Thank you for sharing your video with us.
I mean, I think it shows, that where we as a media have fallen and not done the job, that people are willing to step up and be creative. And we can't sit there and critique them in our big, media church and say, well, they're not doing it the way we would do it. Because both you and I know that as reporters, we're not going to do anything like that. But we need to cover it honestly and represent it honestly for people to see how citizens are pushing back against police power and policing of space. And we need to be honest about it as the media. I think the media generally tends to vilify cop watchers as a bunch of nuts. But I think you take, and this is mostly from you, you have always had an honest, approach and a fair approach to cop watching, because there's something going on. It's a movement that's complex. Like I mentioned, Blind Justice being a person. We have Otto the Watchdog, who I think was here for a while. A variety of people who all approach it in a different way. In fact, Otto the Watchdog told us, who was a cop watcher out of Texas, who told us that he likes to inject humor in it because humor sort of brings people together and is a unifying concept. And it's true. When we all look, we can all say what we like, how we like his approach, but no one can not watch that and not laugh. And there's kind of some of a relief there when you see it. You kind of feel relieved, like, oh, for once I'm not watching a police officer drag a guy. I'm seeing the roles reversed, and he reversed it through humor. And so I think we have a responsibility, as you and I being more mainstream media, so to speak, to cover cop watching, just the way anything else would be covered, any other sort of government entity or power, with the reverence that the mainstream media shows for even the most corrupt politicians. I mean, during Zero Tolerance, the mayor was Martin O'Malley. He went on to be a big Democratic, wonderful liberal guy that everybody embraced and says going to be the next president. And he presided over the most destructive police policy in recent American history. But the media fawned over him like he was the next John F. Kennedy. So I think we should give the same sort of fundamental respect of coverage to cop watching as we do to people like Martin O'Malley. Why not? And so I think what's good, and what we have, I think, tried to do is cover as many different approaches as possible. And really, that particular approach to me was interesting. And I've seen so many interesting creative approaches. Tom Zebra and Laura Shark, have their own style and actually imitated our style, which was one of the best things I've ever seen. And I can go on and on. Batusai, I hope I said his name right. And
the Batusai, and don't forget, Lackluster's great work.
Lackluster does great work. Lackluster does incredible work. Incredible
really
work.
does.
I mean, I wish we could be as good a journalist as Lackluster is a journalist.
I know he really.
But I think we should make a pledge right now that we're going to cover cop watching. Yeah, we're going to cover cop watching just the way all the mainstream media fawns over, police. Okay, so here we are. Here we are.
Here we are. So
maybe
the cop watchers can reach out to us, because that's something I've really noticed, is that the mainstream media seems to go out of its way to ignore the cop watcher and auditor movement, as if it's not happening, as if there isn't this incredibly wonderful democratic impulse, this citizen journalist impulse that is really showing that people care about their communities, they care about their government, they care about accountability, they care about fairness, they care about justice, and they're willing to take their time and their energy and even put their freedom on the line for it. So I think this is a movement that needs to be embraced and at the very least acknowledged by media. So we're going to do our part. We're not exactly MSM, but we're going to do what we can.
No, but we're going to do, we're going to do the same sort of reasoned, rational approach that the mainstream media takes towards irrational institutions. So we're going to cover cop watching, and I'm sure there are a lot of people in the mainstream media who look down on us, say, why are you covering these people this way? They're not rich. They're not powerful. They don't have powerful lawyers. They didn't go to Harvard. Why are you covering them? Which some of them might have, but that's what we've always done. And I think it's something that needs to be covered like that. It needs honest coverage, because these are real issues. And these are people, like you said, there's this myth, I think, in cop watching that these guys are doing it for clicks. But I can tell you that if you look at YouTube, what YouTube pays for advertising, even the most successful aren't getting rich off this. There's an impulse, a great American impulse to fight back against concentration of power, which I think, if there's anything that is American, is a skepticism of concentrated power. I mean, that runs through all of our institutions, hopefully, and the sense that the government is accountable to the people, right? That doesn't mean some elite class that only has access to power. That means all of us. And I think that's what cop watching represents, even in its ugliest form, or forms that we might not agree with. And there's some we don't agree with. But, as we pointed out, Eric Brandt and Abadi are liberty freak. Many people are critical of them, but now they have a case that could do some damage to qualified immunity in the 10th Circuit right now, that has amicus briefs with the Department of Justice and the Cato Institute and the Electronic Freedom Foundation. I mean, so I think we need to be just as objective and as take it as seriously as the mainstream media takes the institution of power that I don't think should be covered the way they're covered. But so that's I think that's one of the good things that come out of it. Maybe we should go to the questions that we had, because
That's what I was going to say. I didn't want to interrupt you because you were, I mean, I just had to sit back and listen. I was enjoying listening to you so much. But no, honestly, you don't get to grab the mic often enough. So I'm really glad we gave you a chance to tonight. So
it shows you why you shouldn't let me come inside. I talk too much.
Don't worry, you're going back out.
Put me back outside.
So what I wanted to do was we had a community post on YouTube the other week, and we asked for your questions and your comments, and a lot of you gave them to us. So we promised that we would engage with those first, and then of course we'll if we have more time, because we're almost at an hour. Wow. If we have more time, we'll engage with some more of the comments and questions that you have put here in the live chat for us. And I just want to say thank you so much for your time, for writing into us, for sharing your comments and questions. We really do appreciate it. And I wish I could answer them all directly. And I apologize if I can't get to yours, but I'm going to try to do at least some of them some justice. So let's see here. So Just Truth, No Feelings, or Craig D from Wisconsin, asked, how can we reform policing? What can the average person do? That is an excellent question, and it's a hard question because it shouldn't have to be on the average person to reform policing. But one of the first things that I would think of is pay attention to the people who are running for government office locally. The national elections are important, but the local ones are just as important. Your municipal officials, your city manager, your mayor, your city council members, you want to find ones and support ones who actually support police reform. Those state delegates, those representatives, they matter too. You need to back ones that actually support real police reform. So that would be one thing.
Yeah, and Taya, Taya,
go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, I was going to say really important, because you made a great point about local governance. Because remember, 17,000 police departments, all controlled. It's not really controlled on a federal. I mean, federal has some input, but those police departments are all local. So get involved with your local government, because they make the decisions.
Right. And then secondly, I wouldn't necessarily advise for everyone to go out there and be a cop watcher.
Well,
but, but that's something that like a regular person can do. But
Oregon Rouge makes a good point. He said film Oregon Rogue, sorry, Rouge says make sure you film your interactions with government, and so if you go to a city council meeting, make sure it's broadcast, or make sure if it's not broadcast, record them. It doesn't mean you have to confront them or do something the auditor does, but record them, so other people can see what's going on.
Yeah, and make sure to attend those meetings too. I
apologize. I read it really fast, Oregon, so my apologies.
And make sure to attend those meetings too, if you can in person, or if you can't in person, do it via Zoom. That's important, because one thing we've noticed is in that a lot of the rural communities that we've covered, there's kind of a media desert. There aren't any investigative reporters around to really focus on what's going on. And if you think your government officials behave badly when people are watching, guess what they do behind closed doors? So they need to know that you're watching. That's so important. So Trey B suggested that they would appreciate a show concerning the sons and daughters of police, judges, and politicians that have privileges of getting away with crimes, but not the same consequences. Wow. Yeah, that would be one heck of a show. Okay. The only thing is how would we narrow it down? Would we want to focus on a state? Would we got to go nationally? Would we want to focus on a decade? That's a lot of people who've been getting away with crimes because of their relationships to power.
I know a lot of cops, because I've been a police reporter, and there's one thing that they told me, that when they get pulled over, as long as they show their badge, no ticket. You know what I mean? Like literally show your badge and you don't get ticketed. And I've heard this from more than one. So I would think that would probably extend to many people in their family. My dad's a cop. Aren't you going to give me a ticket? And it's called professional courtesy, I believe. So just so you know, all of us who have to pay speeding tickets or parking tickets or whatever, just get a badge if you don't want to pay a speeding ticket anymore. So
So someone had a question, Fell Smoke had a question about why is Stephen outside with the microphone? So Stephen, I think you just need to settle this because this is a question that's asked. Why is Stephen outside with a microphone?
Because as you can see, when I'm inside, I talk too much, but
Being
well,
cold keeps them brief.
we, like many
Just
other
teasing.
organizations during the pandemic, we had to shut down some facilities. We couldn't keep our studio open any longer, and I would have not been able to participate in the show had we not come up with a solution, which was just putting me outside, because we have to shoot from our home studio, and there's not enough room for me to be sitting next to Taya. It would look absurd. So all we did was come up. We used to sit side by side, and Taya would be the anchor, and but our studio, it's reopening, but it's smaller, and so I'm outside because it really allows me to participate in the conversation and to report back to Taya. It's not something we, did intentionally. It's something we did to adapt to the circumstances, and so I kind of like it. I mean.
Well, like a lot of companies, we were forced to downsize during the pandemic, and that meant our studio was closed for a period of time, and now it's much smaller. So we're just trying to make do. We're just trying to do the best we can for you with the limitations that we have. But if I can, I'll let Stephen indoors one of these days. So Kelly or KAH asked, have you ever been contacted by any MSM or local news media? Do you submit your stories and investigations? You do excellent reporting and investigating. Well, thank you, Kelly. That's very kind of you. We are occasionally contacted by mainstream media to discuss stories. Like, for example, about 2 weeks ago, the show Rising, which is from The Hill, which is a media organization, contacted us about some of the reporting we were doing on Milton, West Virginia. We don't submit our stories. It's just simply whether or not MSM decides to acknowledge us. Now, we've had mainstream media follow stories we've broken, so that we'll break a story, we'll do an investigation, and then they'll show up later and be like, that was a good idea. I guess we'll follow that story too. I mean, that happened in the case of the death of Anton Black, which was absolutely a terrible case. It occurred in Greensboro, Maryland, down here on what we call the Lower Eastern Shore, and it was a 19-year-old young man who was a track star, had a bright future. He had actually had gotten a part in a movie, and he had come home to visit his mother, and he was walking with his cousin, through marriage, and he was walking with him, and someone called the police as alleging that he was kidnapping his own cousin. The police arrived. Anton got scared and ran. He ran home to his mother's house, and the police they attempted to tase him. They chased him into a car, broke the window, tasered him, and then 3 men got on top of him, put him in a chokehold, and Anton asphyxiated to death. And that family couldn't get any of the body camera footage, couldn't get any help. We have some people who we know who reached out to us. I think it was, as a matter of fact, one of the heads of the NAACP, Richard Potter, reached out to us. And so we went down there and we started covering it. And then the other media organizations started covering it, but there was no traction there until we went down there. We started reporting, and we started getting results for the family. So, the MSM does catch up with us sometimes, but not as often as we'd like, because there's so many stories that need attention, so many people that need help, and unfortunately, they're just not getting it.
Don't forget, Taya, Monkey 83 is here, so let's say hello.
Oh my gosh! Hi, Kyle. So let me go to the next question. Alamander, and by the way, if I mispronounce any of these names, please, it's not on purpose. Please forgive me. Alamander,
at least you didn't say Oregon Rouge.
No comment on that.
Right.
So Alamander asks, have you ever joined forces with civil rights auditors, Long Island Audit, or Blind Justice to bring awareness to their causes and the abuses they face? Well, we've actually done, Blind Justice is in the comments right now. We've actually done two episodes on PAR.
I think 3 stories.
Was it 3 devoted to him?
Yeah, he's been in stories, when we first
he's been
covered
included
the
in
death
other
of that
stories
man
as well.
out in Washington State. And we interviewed him about that. The guy who was shot, the homeless man who was shot by police for apparently no reason. So,
Now, I'm not familiar. I don't know Long Island Audit, but if there's an auditor that you would like me to speak with, or a cop watcher you
Yeah,
would like me to speak with, you can email me at par@therealnews.com, and you can introduce us. You can like tag them in an email, tag me in an email, let me know. Or of course you can message me on Facebook at Taya's Baltimore. You can reach me there. So if you want to introduce me to a cop watcher or auditor, you want me to see their work, or if you can actually literally introduce me to them, I'm open to it. I can't
hey, Taya.
necessarily. I'm sorry. Yes.
Yeah, see, I want to say something. CAP Industries just said something I think we should really acknowledge really quick, and then we'll move on to the questions. He said, he or she said that defund is not a left issue, and that is exactly right. It is an accountability issue. It has nothing to do with ideology. It is about accountability, and I'm glad you said that, and thank you for making that point. It's in all of our interests collectively to hold power accountable. It doesn't matter whether they're Republicans or Democrats. I've covered both. They both respond to power in the same ways. They want more of it, and they give less of it to people who they feel they don't have to. So that's a very good point. We want to acknowledge that it is not a left issue. It is an issue for every person, every citizen of this country should hold power accountable, and policing has a lot of power. Just want to say that. Thank you.
Oh, that Stephen, I'm so glad you engaged with that comment, because that's so important. I really try not to engage with either blue or red ideologies. I try not to engage with that. I try to talk about policies that affect us and
Right.
change that we want to see. And that's not necessarily blue or red. And I think there is a lot of very purposeful distraction that elites both teams use to keep us
Absolutely.
confused, keep us confounded, keep us busy, and keep us from focusing on what they're doing. But let me go to the next person's comment.
Yeah.
So Skylar Ruin said 3 weeks ago, they had this Florida boy standing outside in 29-degree weather for an hour. I had no jacket and it was below freezing. Do I have a valid complaint? Well, I would say this to you, Skylar Ruin. You do have a right to make a complaint. You do absolutely have a right to go down police headquarters or use their website and register a complaint. Now, whether or not I think this is going to rise to any sort of disciplinary measure for the officers, I doubt it. However, you adding your voice to any other complaints that this officer has received may lead to this officer having to rethink this behavior, receiving some sort of discipline, or at least administration speaking to him about it, saying, hey, that's not necessary. That's not a good way to interact with the community. That wasn't useful. So I don't know if it's going to be a lawsuit that gets you millions. I doubt that. However, you do have a right to register a complaint and add your voice to others. So perhaps the next person that happens to, it might help them. So go ahead and register that complaint. Okay, so let me go to this next comment here. Jim Owen said, I think you need to talk to the likes of Ted Cruz, asking him and all the representatives in government why they talk about these subjects, but don't ever answer the questions. So you know what? I would love to have Ted Cruz or any other congressperson sit down and talk with me or Stephen, and that would be great. One of the things I've noticed, though, is that these folks, even when the mainstream media actually ask them a pertinent question, they manage to talk right past it. So it's kind of tough nailing down those wily politicians.
When we finish our investigation of Milton, we are going to find Joe Manchin. I would like to do that, because I'd like to ask him why he has abandoned the people of Joe. Yeah, why he's abandoned the people of that community and abandoned many of the people in West Virginia. So we haven't done that in the past because it's just not logistically possible to go traipsing around Washington chasing politicians. But I think at some point we should do that, because it's worthwhile depending on the story. I definitely think as we progress into our investigation of West Virginia, that we will be hopefully trying to talk to Joe Manchin about some of these problems.
And so I just want to say thank you to Darth Malgus 77 for your kind comment. And thank you to Brad Wolf as well. And thank you to KT. We appreciate the kind support. As you can imagine, we're not members of the MSM. Doing criminal justice system reporting doesn't necessarily make you popular when you friends and influence people, in the sense that people in power aren't exactly happy to see us when we show up. So we really kind of have to rely on the love and support from people like you. So it really does mean a lot, because as you can imagine, I have to go through a lot of body camera footage, autopsy reports, things that are not fun and can be kind of depressing and disheartening. And sometimes it feels
Well,
like
Taya,
an
I think we've
impossible challenge. And so when people like you reach out and say kind things, it does help keep me going. So
well,
I
Taya,
just want to say thank you.
I think we've gone for like an hour now, so we appreciate people's patience. I
Oh,
think maybe we want to wrap it
oh
up.
wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I just want to say thank you to DBD times veggie S and J. Thank you very much. And we, like I said, I really appreciate your kindness. It does help keep me going when the seems a bit dark. Um, so Kyle Hammer and Anthony Windley asks, will you do a video on how to petition local state governments to abolish qualified immunity? Ooh, that's an
Yeah,
interesting
we do have
question.
some
We
stuff.
have a great interview with the Cato Institute that I want to
Yeah,
use part of in
we
one
will
of our next upcoming videos. So
we will delve into qualified immunity soon. You know, we've done reporting on the developments in the lawsuit from Liberty Freak and Eric Brandt regarding qualified immunity, and we will continue that reporting. We have some in-depth coverage on that, and we will continue. And you know, certainly local governments can intervene, and when it's relevant to their state constitutions, can prohibit using qualified immunity. You know, for state constitutional rights, I believe. So, but this is something also we got to petition the federal government, because ultimately this is a federal issue because it's in federal courts and civil rights actions where qualified immunity comes into play. So, we will be doing more on qualified immunity, and you know, I think that's a really good idea. I think the more organization we have, I think when it's one of the most pernicious aspects of the legal system, the craziest thing to ever grow out of legal precedent that I can think of.
that's thank you so much, Stephen. So Sharky's Machine says, if regular citizens can be charged with acting in concert to a felony, then why aren't watching and or participating officers to a felony by fellow officers charged? Oh, that is an excellent question.
Yeah.
And something that we're seeing is that slowly but surely, people are putting pressure for their state legislatures to make those type of changes. And there's actually a question in relation to Massachusetts I'm going to get to, but Massachusetts has put in place a piece of legislation that looks like it could be really good. And one of the things in that piece of legislation is that an officer who witnesses a felony occur, who does not step by a fellow officer and does not step in to act, can also be charged as an accomplice, just in the same way that I would be charged as an accomplice if Stephen was committing a crime and I was sitting at the wheel or something absurd like that. So,
Right.
Stephen, did you want to address that, or would you like me to go on
No,
to
no,
the
no. I
next
mean, I
one?
just saying you're right. There's state legislation. There was legislation in Maryland that police officers have to. But this is really a prosecutorial problem, because prosecutors can certainly, like they did in Minneapolis, charge co-conspirators. They can, but they generally don't. So really, it's up. A lot of state legislators have taken and codified it in the law, including here in Maryland, that you have a duty to intervene, is what it's called, I think. So yeah, but really, it's prosecutorial, because prosecutors certainly have the right, excuse me, to intervene, to charge people who don't intervene.
Stephen, that's such a good point, that it has, the prosecutors have a role here. And in
Yes.
our city, you know, we vote for our city state's attorney, that top prosecutor. And so that says those types of elections are really important too. So James G said, how can citizens acting collectively restrain and limit the influence of police unions? And should we fight for greater control over police hiring decisions? Wow, that is a great question. The
Yeah.
power of police unions cannot be underestimated. Stephen, you want to take a stab at
Well,
that?
I mean, you know, there has to be transparency about what police unions can do in terms of donating money to politicians. I mean, you know, that's one of the things about. It's really interesting because there's a kind of a tradition in American military not to get involved in politics. Well, we have given military forces the ability to not only you know, bargain with their bosses, so to speak, through unionization of police, but you know, really bring the power in the military to bear into the political sphere. When Tay and I are down in Annapolis, which is our state capital, we see police in uniform all over the place. Now, they are not supposed to lobby politicians in their uniform, but they do it anyway. They'll line the halls when it's about police pensions, or line the halls when it's about, you know, was called our police officers' Bill of Rights. And it's very intimidating for the politicians. And so I think we have to hold police accountable. We have to be aware of who the political leaders are. I mean, look, it's possible, though, in Maryland, they got repealed for all intents and purposes, our law enforcement officers' Bill of Rights. So it is possible if people organize and put pressure. It can, but it took a long time. So we have to limit the ability. I think, there has to be some limits on how police can be involved in the political process, how much money they can donate, how much they can lobby. They have very powerful lobbying mechanisms in the form of police union presidents who spend a lot of time and have a lot of influence. So we have to put limits on that in some level.
So let me get to another question from our community post. Ma Gru said, have you got any information on the Massachusetts police reform bill that requires all departments to forward all complaints on officers? It's rumored that bad cops will be dismissed. Well, like I alluded to earlier, Massachusetts has put in place this incredible piece of legislation that is actually supposed to reform policing, and it looks like it has some teeth to it. So now I'm not a resident of Massachusetts. I'm not a reporter there, but I did a little research for you. And so what I found is that first off, they're banning chokeholds outright, which is excellent. And they're also taking a look at the rules around de-escalation when it comes to minors, to make sure that minors are treated, with less than lethal force. Another thing I noticed is that you have to have a court order now to use the facial recognition technology. So they're trying to restrict the use of facial recognition technology, and that a police officer can only use it without a court order if there is like an imminent risk of a substantial loss of life. So that means the facial recognition technology should be limited because most of the time they're going to need a court order. And now, one of the things I noticed is that there's going to be this database where information about police officers, their disciplinary records, their administrative hearings, and whether or not they're going to be certified or decertified, all that information is stored. And that database is going to be used to decide whether or not to decertify officers. And there's supposed to be an independent committee that looks at this. However, one thing I noticed is that the Massachusetts public records law has been amended so that you and me can't look into that database. So that is unfortunate in my way of thinking, that your average citizen can't look into that. I know there are reasons for that, but I do think it's unfortunate that the citizens won't be able to access that to see what kind of complaints have been registered against these officers and to see what kind of disciplinary action is happening. However, overall, this looks like a really good piece of legislation. It just remains to be seen whether or not it's going to have any teeth, if the people really enact it, if people really engage with it, if your politicians actually put pressure so that these officers are truly decertified and that they really follow, these wonderful new requirements they've put into place. So it's, like you said, it's rumored bad cops will be dismissed, and it looks like they put everything in place so that this could happen, but it remains to be seen. So I hope you keep me posted, and I hope you Massachusetts residents let me know, because if this piece of legislation works for your state, maybe it'll work for ours, maybe it'll work for others. So that just shows you the power of change, that when people push back, they can get some good results, because it does look like a good bill. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed for you, Massachusetts. So let's take a look here. If there are any other comments we should grab. We have a nice comment here. Thank you, Benita B. And yep, and I agree. Lackluster and James Freeman are both great. So I just want to check here. Let's see here. Are there any other questions?
There's one comment that's something that I think there was a very interesting comment from Reels of Fortune Slots Play, and he said police have done. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Oh, I can hear you perfectly fine. I'm sorry. I apologize. I was reading the chat to make sure I didn't miss anybody, because there's so many comments.
Police have done a great job at selling, like taxes, police abuses are the price we pay to have a civil society. We need a much more effective counter argument. And, I would say again that the basis of democracy is to prevent the concentration of power in any institution. And there is if you think that, for example, that we here in Baltimore with 300 murders a year with this massive police force live in a civil society or an equitable society, you're mistaken. I would think that in places like we saw in Milton, in places like Baltimore, the more policing you have, it seems like the more inequity. So policing doesn't create civility, and it certainly doesn't create productive outcomes. And it certainly doesn't create better education systems. And it certainly doesn't create clean water. So, policing is a choice like any other institution. We have to take it out of the rhetorical space where it becomes sort of like apostasy to say, okay, I'm either for or against it. That has to stop. And it's very easy because you just say, why can't we hold an institution accountable? What do you have against holding power accountable? That's the question you should ask. Why don't you want to hold power accountable? Should we just give police everything? I mean, should we devote our entire budget? When does it end and when does it stop? And I think that's the question. I think it's a great comment, and I think it's important. We have to counter it. Otherwise, we're going to be stuck in this situation, to who knows what happens.
Well, we've gone over time.
Yeah.
We've gone over a bit longer than I expected, but I'm really glad we had this opportunity to chat, to let Stephen actually really grab the mic. You can see why he's my reporting partner and my mentor, to be perfectly honest. He's taught me pretty much everything I know about investigative journalism. I'm really glad that you had a chance to really show the type of reporting you've done and the work that you've done. And I guess I would just say that we have to remember that all of us involved in holding police accountable do so with one thing in mind, and whether that's you're a cop watcher or a journalist or an auditor or just a concerned citizen. And that's because we want to make life better for our communities. And I don't think I've come across anyone who in the cop watcher or auditor community, or even, a lot of the local journalists I've met who didn't really want to improve the lives of their fellow citizens. And I think that's the most important takeaway from our talk, is that everyone that's here right now, everyone that's in the chat, everyone that's reached out to us, they care about justice. They care about accountability. You care about justice and accountability. That's why we're here. That's why we have these conversations every week. And that's why we do these investigations, because we're trying to give back, and also, in our own small way, to try to give some help so that there's a little bit more justice and fairness in the world.
Well, Taya,
wouldn't you agree?
Taya, just by letting me inside, you have improved my life. Just by letting me come inside for one night, you have improved my life. So I totally concur. But I agree, the point of journalism has to be about improving people's lives, or really, what's the point of it, right? Because if it doesn't serve the people who watch it, then why would they watch it? We have to pay attention to what's important to people in the world, and not just pay attention to what's important to us. And that's why we cover small communities across the country, and why we try to bring accountability to governments that we don't live in, because we care about what people care about, and we care about what they need. And that's our job. We're in a sense, sort of freelance public servants in that sense. And we don't serve the public. We don't serve anybody. So yes, I agree with your message. And please keep in touch with us, and please keep sending us tips and guidance, because we are here to serve you.
We're here for you. We do this work for you. We do this work for people who care about justice, people who care about accountability, people who care about fairness, and people who care about these ideals that we all grew up with, that are enumerated in the Constitution. We care about these things, and we want them to be a reality for everyone in this country. So I want to thank you, Stephen, for joining me tonight for this conversation. I want to thank Jocelyn. Lacey. I want to thank Noli D. I want to thank Lacey R., who's been going at it, being a terrific mod.
Justice. And Friends in Code. Friends in Code. Don't forget that.
Hey there. Hi, Friends in Code. So, I mean, there's so many people we could say hi to. And of course, I have to say hi to Pineapple Girl and Shane Busta, our PAR super friends that are our patrons. So we're
take us out with you always take us out with.
Okay. So, as you know, you can always reach out to me at par@therealnews.com and share your evidence of police misconduct or brutality. And you can reach out to us also on Police Accountability Report on Facebook or Instagram, or at Eyes on Police on Twitter. And you can always reach out to me directly at Taya Baltimore on Twitter or Facebook. And as always, please share and comment. I read your comments and appreciate them, even if I don't always get a chance to answer. I promise you, I have probably read your comment. I am Taya Graham, and I am your host of the Police Accountability Report. Please be safe out there.